ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
There are plenty of people you see on the telly or read in the paper who come across as calm, thoughtful, seriously together human beings, people who have something to say and who know how to say it. It's why they're in the media in the first place. But of course, such people are just as accident-prone, disaster-prone, catastrophe-prone as anyone else in this world, maybe even more so. So we thought we'd offer a group of such people a chance to own up, to confess their terrible blunders, as well as those of other people, and to seek forgiveness for all those mistakes in public without shame or rancour. And so a few weeks ago we presented a special event at Adelaide Writers Week, an afternoon of people telling personal stories under the title Mistakes Were Made. All of them are former guests and one current presenter of this very program. The event was recorded at the Adelaide Town Hall, where these people received absolution from a live audience of 800 loving and forgiving Adelaideans. We've asked these four people to bring you their stories of human failure, misadventure, and outright fiasco, but in the spirit of forgiveness and understanding of human brokenness, all gathered under the theme, Mistakes Were Made. Now, mistakes were made is an enormously useful phrase. It's a rhetorical device, often used by politicians, that is an admission of failure, but allows the speaker to carefully step away from responsibility for it. Mistakes were made is the king of the non-apology, along with, I'm sorry you feel that way, and I apologise if I offended anybody, and if my remarks accidentally picked up on the microphone, give anyone the false impression that I was disrespectful to President Trump's hair and makeup, then I deeply regret that. Mistakes were made was a phrase coined by an official in the Nixon administration in the United States, and the political class quickly picked up on it. The phrase became so widespread in Washington that one commentator noted that a new tense had been added to the English language that he named the past exonerative. When former President George Bush's chief of staff was accused of abusing his White House travel expenses, he said, quote, "Clearly, no one regrets more than I do the appearance of impropriety. Obviously, some mistakes were made." When former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans was accused of causing offence to the Malaysian Prime Minister, a surprisingly easy thing to do, Gareth said that he wanted to, quote, "acknowledge fault where such acknowledgement is appropriate." My friend Jack the Insider has pointed out that Australians have coined their own ingenious form of the past exonerative. I think in this country we find that if a public figure disgraces themselves in public, when they're asked to explain how it was they ended up dancing on a nightclub table with their underpants on their head, they will inevitably use the phrase, "It transpired that." It's very simple. Something transpired. Who was responsible for what transpired, we can't possibly know. And now I'd like you to respect my family's privacy going forward. So mistakes were made, I think, strikes the right note here today. It's a phrase that's spoken in the passive voice. There is an object and a verb, but the subject has run from the scene and is currently living in an undisclosed location under the Witness Protection Plan. There's no I or we or us attached to these mistakes because there is no judgment here today, just forgiveness and love for our four storytellers going forward. So let's get underway with our very first guest, Rebecca Huntley. Rebecca Huntley is Director of Research at 89 Degrees East. For years, she was the Director of the Mind and Mood Report. Rebecca's also the author of several books. Her latest is called Sassafras, a memoir of love, loss and MDMA therapy. Please welcome Rebecca Huntley.
Thank you so much, Richard. My story is full of mistakes, full of them. It's about the day I got my licence. The day I got my licence, I was 20. I got my licence quite late because I had managed to line up appropriately a series of boyfriends who were able to drive me around from 16 to 20. But at 20, I found myself single. My sister had already got her licence. She was younger than me, to my great chagrin, but my mother had said that she would be a more appropriate person on the road with her car, which I was very offended about, but not too perturbed until I no longer had a boyfriend to drive me around. And then I said, well, you help me get my licence now. And she said, no. And she gave me the number of somebody who could teach me. But then I got my licence, which is exciting. And the first day I got my licence, this is a very long time ago, you got a slip of paper when you got it, which said that you were able to drive, and the actual licence the proper plastic one would come in the mail. I came home, I told my mother I got my licence, and I was supposed to be going out that night to see a play with a friend of mine, and we were supposed to be going to a party. And my mother, the week before, had bought the first new car she ever owned. It was a Saab. It was a new Saab. And I said to her, can I take the Saab out? And she looked at me and she said, and this is a moment, I could almost see the cogs in her head turning. And she said, yes. However, if something happens, you don't sign anything that you haven't read in its entirety. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, if you have an accident, a policeman will come, he will write down what happened, and you need to read it before you sign it. Of course, I was absolutely appalled. What do you mean? The state of New South Wales thinks I can drive. I've got a slip of paper to prove it. My own mother. Anyway, so she said, yeah, take this up. So I get in the Saab, I drive over to pick up my friend Danny. We go and see the play at Bondi, the Bondi Pavilion. It was a very bad play and we thought we'd get to the party early. And I just felt like, do you understand, I was single. I had a Saab, not my Saab. I had a slip of paper from the New South Wales government saying I could drive. I had a wing woman there and I was so excited. We got in the Saab. It had a cassette player. You know, you could play music, not on a radio, a cassette player. And I put in the music that is the soundtrack of so many disasters. George Michael's album, Faith. I put it in and I'm driving along. I'm driving in Bondi. I'm so excited. There's a song on the cassette player I didn't like. So I looked down from the road whilst driving and I don't know how this happened. I didn't realise that if you just didn't keep your eyes on the road, like suddenly the conditions could change. And I ploughed into a line of parked cars in front of a pub. The Saab hit one car and another 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 car. I didn't realise it at the time because when it happened, because if anybody knows about Swedish car technology, the Saab is a kind of crumple zone, right? Crumples, the first part of the crumples, and you are protected. I didn't even get whiplash. So at this stage I thought that maybe I might be able to easily reverse and just kind of see everything is right. And I will never forget the sound of twisted metal with the beautiful kind of I want your sex kind of slightly at the back, slightly askew whiff, kind of almost like you know that book called Crash and the movie? It was a bit like that. It was really horrible. And, you know, I mean, I know that the music of George Michael has been the background of many a rear-end collision, but I don't think he really would have been ever... You don't think he was prepared for this, right? So I realised I actually couldn't reverse. And we got out, and I thought, OK, the next car's destroyed. But I just looked one car after another. It was like bang, 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 bang. Once I'd worked out that I'd actually destroyed a lot of cars, including the one that was between me and the second one was just completely like this. How we got walked away from this was hard to know, but we thank God for the Saab technology. What I didn't realise is that I had done this outside one of the Soul Pubs in Bondi, it probably doesn't exist anymore, which was an old-fashioned pub, the kind of pub where disappointed men go to drink at 11 a.m. and continue for the rest of the day. And, of course, they were happily enjoying their 17th beer while a 20-year-old girl takes a completely new car and just smashes it. Anyway, they were so excited. They pour out of this pub. I still remember the heavy, sweaty hands of them around. They're kind of draped around me. And one of them whispered in my ear, "This is the best thing that's happened to me all week." They were just so thrilled. So I was standing there on this pavement with these drunk men just like looking at they were thrilled, all these cars, and I just didn't know what to do. Then suddenly all of these tow trucks arrive. I don't know where they come. They just kind of like come out of nowhere, waiting to take away the twisted metal. And a policeman walks up and I say, "Hello, officer," which is something that I'd only ever thought I'd say in a mass orgy. I never thought actually a nice white girl like me would never ever have to say that in real life. Like, "Hello, officer." And he said, "Hello." And I said, "Am I in trouble?" Something else I only ever thought I'd have to say at a mass orgy, "Hello, officer, am I in trouble?" But I was saying it in real life. And he said, "It depends." And I said, "On what?" And he said, "What happens after you blow into this?" Because he had the thing that sees if you had been drinking. I hadn't been drinking. He blew into it, and he was almost disappointed that I hadn't been drinking, you know what I mean? Like, it's always like, "You've done this sober." It's like, I am very worried. Anyway, and so then the next thing he says to me is, "Can I see your licence?" And I pull out this slip of paper with the day's date. And he says, he looks at it and he goes, "Did you get your licence today?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "How old?" He says, you're 20. And I said, "Yep." He says, "This is a new Saab." And I said, "Yep." He says, does this, it doesn't belong to you, does it?" I said, "No, it belongs to my mother." And he's like, it looked to me like whatever the law enforcement system can do to you will be nothing compared to what you're like, almost like a flicker of disappointment, but also pity. Anyway, so then he says, "Tell me what happened." And I tell him the story, I include the George Michael details. Details are always important. And he hands it over and he says, "Sign it." And then, of course, my mother's voice comes into my head. And I said, "I need to read it before I sign it." So there's nothing. Anyway, so I read it and it was all accurate. Anyway, so he goes away, the tow trucks go away, all the rest of it. And the guys who were drunk, there was no more sport anymore for them, so they pile back into the... I'd say to my friend Danny, just go home. And this is time before mobile phones, so I had to go to a public phone to call my mother to pick me up. And I rang her and I said, "Mum, I've destroyed the car, can you pick me up at Bondi?" And she did. It was one of her finest moments. Anyway, in the weeks after this, all these people who owned these cars had to ring me because we had to swap insurance details. The young man who owned the car that I completely totaled, he'd gone out for a night in Bondi and came back and his car, he couldn't even get into his car, right? It was parked on a well-lit street. I was particularly nice to him over the phone. Remember, this is before the internet. Doesn't know what I look like. I'm just a student, and so we were chatting. I was just trying to be very nice to him. And he was very nice to me. And then about a week after we had this initial conversation about insurance, he rang me and I said, "Do you need some more details?" And he said, "Oh, no, I just wanted to know, did you want to get dinner and a drink sometimes?" Now, what makes a man go out for a nice evening in Bondi, come home and his car is destroyed and he thinks, if this was a woman who did this, I would like to take her out to dinner? And I declined, but as my friends always said to me, "You should have said, sure, let me pick you up."
Rebecca Huntley's most recent book is Sassafras, a memoir of love, loss and MDMA therapy. Next up is Julia Zemiro. Julia is, of course, a much-loved TV presenter, actor and performer. She's hosted TV shows like Rock Quiz, Julia Zemiro's Home Delivery and Great Australian Walks. And she's also one of the cast members of the massively popular TV comedy series Fisk on ABC TV.
So I go into this meeting once with a producer in commercial TV to talk new ideas for shows, pitches. I was feeling disillusioned about work, and this was before COVID. I go into this meeting and this producer wants to hear some original ideas, some OGs. And I'm thinking, you know what? Maybe I'm done with performing. Maybe I don't want to be on stage or on screen anymore. Maybe I should be doing something else. I mean, I'm only 52. I'm young enough to retrain and go and do something more, look, I'm going to say it, useful. I've been doing this performing lark for a while now, from performing Shakespeare in high schools out of the back of a van, or playing theatre sports and learning how to fail with a smile, or juggling dozens of characters in TV sketch comedy, and long periods of waitressing, it's a kind of performing, and teaching drama to kids and adults, and seeing quite beautiful transformations, and teaching improv skills to big corporations in an effort to remind their staff, or should I say their CEO and their managers, how to reconnect with one another and communicate effectively, because they just don't remember how to do it anymore. I've had the highly paid gigs and the can you do it for free gigs, the full gamut of it really. And maybe I'm done. People don't really value the arts. I mean, does anyone really care apart from us who make it? And are we not our own worst enemies as artists? And should we not even use the word arts anymore and just call it Joanne? I just don't know. We have to keep banging our head against the wall. So let's just give in and just finally accept that sport will always be more powerful in this country than culture on every single level. Anyway, I go into this meeting in this rather, I think, positive state of mind. And I'm thinking, what's it all about? And I'm very keen to talk that through. I say to the producer, you must be frustrated with me that I don't come in here and pitch things, but hasn't it all been done? Is there anything really left to say? And am I the one to say it? Because really, why make something if you don't have anything important to say? And look, Jesus, am I only just overthinking it? Julia, relax. And this producer says to me, well, it's interesting in your case because you're not someone that comes in with original ideas. You're more of a hired hand. Wow. A hired hand. Well, it's true that home delivery was not my original idea and hosting Eurovision was not my original idea. But look, that started in 1956, to be fair, when I wasn't even born, although my mother was pregnant with me in 1967 in France when Sandy Shaw won the contest with Puppet on a String. So Eurovision was in me in utero, sure, but no, not technically my idea. And Rock Quiz wasn't my idea either, so no original ideas. I was hired to host and facilitate all three, but he's still talking and I'm listening to him continue talking. All I can hear is, blah, 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 hired hand, blah, 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 hired hand, blah, blah. Like, wow, hired hand, do you reckon? Okay. And I say nothing in the moment, there, in the meeting. And it's interesting because on the one hired hand, I'm embarrassed. But on the other hired hand, I'm angry. And isn't anger a fantastic motivator? It's interesting that even this person whose job it is to support artists and see the kind of contribution I make as what? Being a hired hand? What does that even mean? What I should have said is, with all due respect, and I'm not comparing myself to Cate Blanchett, it's just an example. But is Cate Blanchett a hired hand when she's an actress in a film? She didn't write the film, she's not directing it, but she brings in all her creativity to that role. But I don't say that, because I am in light entertainment. I go home with my ears burning. I should have said something, but the thing is, I wasn't quite sure what to say in the moment. There's actually a French expression for thinking of the perfect reply too late. It's l'esprit de l'escalier, which literally means the spirit of the stairs, and I'm not quite sure what stairs have got to do with it, but still. I mean, maybe when you're going down, you're leaving the thing, you've come down the stairs, you've gone, oh, should have said that, and then you go back up the stairs. Anyway, too late, but the spirit of the stairs. I stew on this producer's feedback for a little while. Feedback, hey? I don't mind a bit of feedback. Please, do tell me what you think. I will write it all down. I will absolutely use none of it if it's not helpful. However, I'm not so up myself that I don't realise the feedback is useful. The best piece of feedback I received at my 3-year acting school, apart from close your mouth when you finish talking, was from a teacher who we all adored, but who refused to be adored and therefore was the best kind of teacher. She said to me once, "You do realise you're constantly seeking my approval?" "What?" I say. "In class, when I set you a task or an exercise, you're always, Anne, look at this. Anne, is this correct? Look, Anne, watch." And she was right. I was 24 and still doing this, mortified. Her point being that if I always played to the room for some kind of reaction, I wasn't working for myself, for my own satisfaction. That to be constantly hoping for others to notice was a door to madness. Create because you've got something to say. Create because you have to, not to please. Now that feedback travels with me always. Back to the commercial producer. I would occasionally see this person in real life, but give them l'épaule froide, which is the cold shoulder. But the feedback kept gnawing at me. Maybe they were right. I couldn't keep stewing in my own light entertainment juices. I realised I had been insulted. He had insulted me without knowing it. A mistake had been made. So I decided to let them know. For the people at home, I'm just miming some very good typing. The reason I have been aloof is that I was annoyed by an expression you used when we last met. A hired hand suggests that I bring nothing original or new to a project, that I'm just a mouthpiece. It might not have been what you meant, but it has stuck with me, bolstered me perhaps. I would argue that as a host in very different shows like Rock Riz, Home Delivery, Eurovision, I've tailored 3 very different types of personas and approaches, all of which involve improvising original material from scratch. Just because I don't write a script or come up with the ideas, I'm still about the manner, the professionalism and the hard work I put in. Send. Well, they write back within minutes. I've hit a nerve. Satisfying. Well, he's mortified. Oh, just let it out of the bag. It was a man. What a surprise. Quelle surprise, mes amis. And he's so relieved to hear why I've given him l'épaule froide. He's respectful and apologetic. That's not how he meant it to sound, and he was clumsy in his descriptions. I mean, he does use in my defence a little bit, but look, it's an honest reply. Bless. Am I still feeling disillusioned about performing? Oh, absolutely. Even more so since the pandemic. Do I feel useful? Did it propel me into writing an original TV work? No. But what I should have added, though, is when I do work on something, it doesn't have to be my idea, but my ideas go into it. Us hired hands maybe are more generous. We share our ideas and we don't have to say, that's mine. Maybe it's about different kinds of ownership. Maybe I don't need to own it. And just quietly, who do you think is going to bring your OG idea to life? Other OGs? You can't fulfill the original idea without the hired hands. Because who's going to take your original, sometimes quite ordinary, pedestrian writing and make it sing? Me, good communicator of ideas, plays well with others, hired hand.
That's Julia Zemiro. Her TV series, Great Australian Walks, is available on SBS On Demand.
Podcast, broadcast, conversations with Richard Feidler.
Next up is Rick Morton. Rick Morton is one of Australia's most outstanding journalists whose background has led him to focus on so many issues surrounding poverty in Australia. Rick is currently the senior reporter with the Saturday paper, and he's won 2 Walkley Awards for his coverage of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. Rick Morton grew up in regional Queensland, which was the setting of his brilliant memoir titled 100 Years of Dirt.
This story actually comes from when I was writing my first book, 100 Years of Dirt. You may be familiar with the themes, but maybe not the fact that I'm about to make fun of a lot of it. The ice addiction didn't do much for my brother's budding art practice. Toby had some natural talent, but during this phase he became obsessed with drawing mushrooms on everything. He would spend days and nights traipsing through the mountains where, he said, a red-bellied black snake gave advice on the best bits of found wood for turning or shaping. Between the psychedelic mushroom prints and the most hideous chunks of wood from the mountains, Toby was producing the kind of art reserved for interior designers who might wander the stalls of a weekend market, consider the wares on display and think, no, not shit enough. Things were not going well, as you might imagine, and he had returned home against Mum's will to live underneath the old Queenslander home where the walls were flat panels exposed to the world and the floor a concrete that had never even heard the term brushed. He was camping, basically, and during winter he brought in a half-cut 44-gallon drum to hold a fire. And then he held court with all of his mates, who were also ice addicts or full-blown drunks. Fat Boy was one of them, and another one was called Beetle, because he had fallen on his back once and found it difficult to get up. I didn't come up with the name. They were their names, chosen. And then there was Kevin, the town petty criminal who had never tried to ply his trade anywhere else, which was, in hindsight, a somewhat limiting strategy. Being the only thief in a small country town is like farting in an elevator of 2. Or being the third Hemsworth brother. They might not know it was you straight away, but they'll eventually figure it out. Kevin, bless him, never let any of this dampen his resolve. He'd been in and out of various facilities since he was a teenager. And after first robbing us when I was in primary school, you never forget your first, he and my brother became friends in adulthood, and he was often around at the house. Mum was kind to Kevin, even maternal on occasion, but she made it very clear to my brother that she didn't want his friends traipsing through the place at 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. or, frankly, any of the shit that followed when they did. This was her sanctuary, and not one of those sanctuaries for rehomed former medical chimps. This was a quiet oasis in the middle of the scenic rim, which is not as suggestive as that might sound. But it was not to be. A local man had chased my brother through her yard with an axe. She frowned upon this. If he'd stopped to take to a nuisance shrub, she might have been okay about it, but he never did, always with the chasing. And one day, Mum went downstairs under the house and discovered my brother making glass pipes to smoke meth. "Now, how the hell did he learn glass blowing, Rick?" she said to me. "It's a skill." Part of me liked the fact the home existed in its disparate hemispheres. Mum upstairs doing craft and scrapbooking. My brother downstairs also doing craft. It was like Better Homes and Gardens if Noni Hazelhurst had a friend called Nugget. These were tough times, and some of Mum's great fears were slowly materialising. The house was raided, and 2 officers called Leather and Patch, no, I'm not making that up, Leather and Patch, were mean about her fence in their official notes. They described it as run down. "Why did they have to pick on the fence?" she said to me. "What's that got to do with drugs?" The fence, for what it's worth, was first taken out by a car on the actual morning of September 11, 2001, just after I'd left for school, and when the kids on the bus saw the car that had come to rest against the house as they turned the corner bound for high school, news spread to everyone except me. All day, as George W. Bush swore revenge on the terrorists who had brought down the World Trade Center, I was asked if I was okay. And I was surprised that anybody needed my thoughts on the humanitarian and geopolitical ramifications of the tragedy. "Well," I said tentatively, "I'm not sure the world will ever be the same again." And they thought, "OK, mate, it's just a fence. Sorry we asked." But 'twas not just a fence. The fence was an idea that was also taken out by a second car a decade later, which is why it was run down, Leather and Patch, you bastards. Mum has never broken a rule in her life. I think once she fed bread to a duck at a city park and only saw the sign after. Now, of course, the cops were around her place every other week, it seemed, making their little observations and looking for contraband. And the violence became more frequent. In the middle of 2017, I was home writing my first book, and Mum and I were upstairs watching Bridget Jones Baby when we heard an uncertain, but nonetheless, that's an important detail, an uncertain but nonetheless ugly commotion from under the house. We looked at each other in a moment of concern, and the noises continued and became more alarming. We moved to investigate. I paused Bridget Jones's Baby. From under the house, Kevin exited and slumped to the ground. An extraordinarily drunk fat boy had stabbed him in the neck with a severed golf club. And now he was bleeding out on the concrete at the base of the stairs. "I can't feel my face," he howled. Fat boy had taken off. He would be found later on that night at the pub. I would call the ambulance, I told Mum, if she called the cops, and my brother, meanwhile, had run not to his friend to render assistance or first aid, but to the fence to reassure somebody walking their dog that everything was completely fine, which it was not completely fine. "Go and help your friend," I yelled to him while on the phone to 000. Now, I'd lived in the city too long, and while I knew at the back of my mind that Boonah had a hospital, I just assumed it was like a hole-in-the-wall sort of thing where you could rent the asthma nebulizer like when I was a kid, and maybe, if you were feeling adventurous, get a catheter. But no, it actually does have an emergency department, and when I learned of this while on the phone to the ambulance, I yelled at my brother, "Why aren't we taking Kevin there?" And so my brother bundled him into the car, drove him 1 kilometre up the exact same street that we live on, dumped him at emergency, and then took off back home to pack up his stuff and do a runner. He gathered his things into a sad little backpack, like Dora the Explorer with a criminal record, and then admonished us for calling the police. "What did you call them for?" he said. "Because your mate stabbed your other mate in the goddamn neck," I said, as if I was talking to somebody who could see reason, and then his dog walked through the pool of blood and left its print across the concrete. And then he was gone with the night, and Mum and me were left to wait for the detectives and to give our statements. The local police sergeant arrived at the door and saw me and said, "Oh, g'day, Rick, you're home." And I said I missed the serenity. He separated Mum and I to take our statements, and he said, "Now just give me as much detail as you can about what happened," as he had me alone. I said, "Well, Mum and I were upstairs watching Bridget Jones Baby." And he said, "Right, so you're upstairs watching a movie?" And I said, "Yeah, Bridget Jones Baby." And he said, "Yeah, look, we're probably not going to need that level of detail." I did my best Renee Zellweger face. And I said, "Oh, what? All of a sudden we're ruling out potential motives. Nice police work, pal." The cat knocked over something in the kitchen and Mum said, "What's Charlie into?" And I said, "Drugs, probably." Eventually, when they all went home that night, it was just Mum and I, and our nerves were shot, of course. We didn't know what else to do, and so I just looked at her and I said, Do you want to finish Bridget Jones's Baby?" Thank you.
Rick Morton is the author of 100 Years of Dirt and My Year of Living Vulnerably. Finally, it's a story from my friend, colleague, and co-presenter of this very program, Sarah Kanowski, who quite frankly is lucky to be alive after making a few interesting mistakes with her husband in the Amazon basin in South America.
Hello, everybody. Being here in Adelaide Town Hall, I'm reminded actually of a mistake I made in this very place exactly 1 year ago. It was the Adelaide Writers Week 2024 opening night party, and I was wearing a denim jumpsuit, as is my wont. That jumpsuit had a zip down the front, and when I went to the bathroom just outside there, the zip went down fine. It didn't come back up. Now, for anyone who's not clear on the architecture of the jumpsuit, once the zip's down, there's nothing but my underwear between me and Adelaide Writers Week. And what's worse, the toilets are at the far end of the foyer, so I was going to have to make an escape through this throng of international authors and dignitaries and somehow make it back to the hotel through the mean streets of Adelaide, all completely unzippered. It was a scene of frenzy and of panic in that toilet cubicle. I almost considered texting Richard, who was out in the foyer quaffing champagne and talking about the Byzantine Empire. But then I figured, how was he going to help anyway? Finally, with more dexterity and attention than I ever manifested in any of my high school home ec classes, I managed to re-thread that zip, get it back up and make it out of Adelaide Town Hall with my modesty intact. Now, you might know that 2025 is the 20th anniversary of Conversations. Well, 20 years ago, as Richard was concocting this program from the relative safety of the ABC Brisbane offices, I was in a land far, far away, making a trip down the Amazon River. My husband Nigel and I were spending a year in South America. We'd already been in Ecuador for a few months teaching English, where I'm ashamed and a little confused to recall that our entire pedagogy was based on the heads, shoulders, knees and toes song. We'd also volunteered on a farm in the cloud forest right on the border with Colombia. But that experience deserves a talk and probably a Four Corners investigation all of its own. Having dispensed the entirety of our linguistic and agricultural wisdom to the people of Ecuador, we set off for Peru and the Amazon. I'd always dreamt of travelling to Iquitos there, partly because of the Werner Herzog film Fitzcarraldo, which stars Klaus Kinski, a man who was both Herzog's muse and his tormentor. The film was inspired by the true story of Fitzcarraldo's quest to build an opera house in Iquitos during the rubber boom of the early 1900s, a quest which, for complicated reasons, involved pulling a steamboat over a jungle-covered mountain in the Amazon. Unsurprisingly, neither Fitzcarraldo's original plan nor Herzog's filming went smoothly. A local tribe ended up offering to kill Kinski on Herzog's behalf. But luckily for Klaus, that was one mistake not made in the jungle. Iquitos is the largest city in the world, only accessible by boat or by plane. There are no roads in or out. It's far too deep in the Amazon for that. Nigel and I certainly didn't have the budget for plane trips, so we arranged to get a lift on the back of a ute to the end of the highway, a day's hot and filthy drive, to a place called Uramaguas. This was a great, grubby, scrappy port town full of shops selling ropes and machetes and hammocks, of shoeshine boys looking for tips, and bar after bar strung along the muddy edge of the river. It was there that we found passage to Iquitos on a boat called the Eduardo and set up our newly purchased hammocks on deck. The one private cabin was booked by a man who was travelling with 28 fighting cocks used in betting rings around the Amazon. At dawn on the second day, we joined up with the mighty Amazon River itself. It was a grey, rain-streaked morning. There seemed to be water everywhere. In Iquitos, we ended up staying in a place run by a shadowy American who was off hunting the big game in Alaska. The hostel was full of stuffed animals who'd presumably already succumbed. There were also two very much alive giant macaws who wandered about freely and, I would say, threateningly. In that strange place, with a polar bear in the hall and jaguar skins on the wall, we met two fellow travellers. Let's call them Liam and Scott, for those were their names. Liam was a sweet, shy redhead from Cork, while Scott was a self-described seeker, a maple tapper from Ontario. He was tall and tanned and had come to the jungle to learn things, man. In particular, Scott told us over a beer and under the fierce eye of a macaw, he was in the Amazon to try ayahuasca. Now, these days, ayahuasca is almost mainstream, the psychedelic equivalent of a kale smoothie or vinyasa yoga. And the healing power of mind-altering drugs is the subject of research studies. But 20 years ago, neither Nigel nor I had ever heard of ayahuasca. And anyway, we weren't drug people. I once thought I'd taken ecstasy at a club on my 19th birthday, but I think if you only think that happened, then it didn't. But for Scott, ayahuasca was some legendary means of shamanic transformation. I also got the sense he was really keen to be able to tell his buddies back under the maple leaves that he'd done ayahuasca in the Amazon, man. So the next day, when we were at the Mercado de Brujas, the witches' market, a real place in Iquitos, where alongside potions for male love power and kidney stones, elderly ladies will sell you San Pedro cactus from where mescaline is derived, Scott found a man, let's call him Carlos, for that was his name, who agreed to take him on a canoe deep into the jungle, eventually to a shaman's compound to partake in the sacrament of ayahuasca. Scott asked us and Liam to come along and help defray the cost of hiring Carlos and his canoes. And so, halfway through our year in South America, thousands of miles away in body and spirit from everything that was familiar, Nigel and I thought, what could go wrong? Thus began a journey of 6 days and nights through the waterways and jungles of the Amazon. A journey where we encountered, and what's more, were encouraged to hold for photographs, piranhas and anacondas. A journey where the canoe carrying our food, including the live chicken that we were to eat after all the other food ran out, capsized. The food sank to the bottom of the river and the chicken escaped. I can still see it skidding across the water and squawking off under the trees. Somehow, learning that there was suddenly this captive market, that night a man appeared on a canoe selling grilled bush rat splayed out on a large banana leaf. Even as hungry as I was, I knew that whatever the preceding adjective, it was still rat, and it tasted like you would imagine rat would taste. As the days went on and on, I started to feel like Werner Herzog, and then like Fitzcarraldo himself, driven mad by the heat, by the relentless insects, all of which wanted to bite me, the absence of toilets or any privacy, the constant faux mystic droning of Scott, the fact that with my rudimentary Spanish I'd ended up as the go-between between Scott and Carlos, Our poor guide, who was himself increasingly unhappy that I, Sarita, was not more enthusiastic about this experience that he was providing out here in the jungle with the insects and the heat and the bush rat. Perhaps this was not the ideal state in which to arrive at a shaman's hut for a night of ayahuasca. And yet, on that final day, as darkness fell, we gathered on a raised platform under a thatched roof. Liam, Scott, Nigel and I, and the shaman, an Indigenous man in his late 60s, wearing an old baseball cap and a white loincloth. To release its hallucinogenic properties, the ayahuasca vine, native to the Amazon rainforest, is brewed up into a muddy yellow, viscous and utterly rank drink. The shaman sings over it, then burps into it, then hands it to you to drink. Another thing worth knowing about ayahuasca is that in addition to being an extremely intense psychedelic, it's also a purgative. When you drink it, you vomit. The person next to you vomits, and the person next to them. It turns out that's why this hut was built on stilts, so you could vomit off the side if your legs still worked to get you there. The only person not vomiting is the shaman. He's singing and burping. Over that long night in the middle of the Amazon, I was visited by a fantastical kaleidoscope of animals, fish and snakes, sea creatures of all kinds. When I could look up, the night sky was extraordinary, as were the bowel evacuations when they hit. Best not to look down. At last, the sun rose over the trees, and I was back on the other side of wherever it was I had been. In that dawn light, Nige revealed that his mystic animal spirit guide had been Baloo, the Jungle Book bear as imagined by Disney. For anyone who knows him, this seems fitting. Scott was pumped up on having been so expanded, while Liam was very, very quiet. As we made our way out on the canoe, I remember him crouching as much of his body as he could under the cross seat. I don't know if it was the sun or the visions he was trying to hide from. On that last canoe ride, we saw pink river dolphins, really this time, not just in our minds. And then, astonishingly, the shaman, the Prospero of our nighttime revels, canoed by in the opposite direction, wearing jeans, smoking a cigar, and accompanied by two young women, their long black hair blowing in the river breeze. For Nige and I, getting out of the Amazon was no easy come down. We found ourselves on an even older, even slower cargo boat, the Henry, where, mysteriously, the cooks were a crew of hard-working Peruvian ladyboys who did each other's hair and makeup when they weren't plucking and boiling chickens. We slept in rows of hammocks crowded over the engines, and as the only gringos on board, Nige and I were a source of endless fascination. The days turned into nights, nights turned into days, and no one could tell us when we might actually arrive at a town with the road out of the jungle. When we went looking for the captain, we found him locked in the wheelhouse on the upper deck with a rifle on his lap. For the other passengers, the Henry was a party ship, a holiday from the routine and labour of their everyday lives, the chance to play cards and 80s pop music very loudly all night. But by then, Nige and I just wanted to be away. We were dreaming of Lima and its promise of showers and pisco sours. We never saw Liam or Scott again. I hope they made it out okay too. Was that trip into the Amazon a mistake? I've never been tempted to try ayahuasca again, and I would be terrified to think of my kids facing those dangers. But even if it was a mistake, I'm really glad their dad and I made it together. You don't get adventures like that without the risk of everything going very, very wrong. And as for learning from mistakes, this year my jumpsuit has buttons for fail-safe opening and closing.
Sarah Kanowski, mistake maker and fellow presenter of Conversations.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fiedler.
Huge thanks to Kat and the team at the Adelaide Town Hall, to Russell from ABC Adelaide for the recording, and to Louise Adler and Suzanne Critchley from Adelaide Writers Week. This program was made on the lands of the Kaurna people. Producer was Alice Moldovan. Executive producer was Carmel Rooney. I'm Richard Fiedler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Hello there, I'm Mark Fennell, and you may know me as the guy who finds the stuff that the British stole. Still doing that, but I'm also embarking now on a new hunt. This is a hunt for the people, the objects, the actions, the stuff-ups, the moments that essentially changed the course of history, but at the time, no one saw them coming. Each week, we will unravel stories from across the globe, from bizarre crimes you might never have heard of.
He's using the early 20th century equivalent of a high-vis vest and a lanyard to get into the Louvre undetected.
To brushes with death that changed science.
He sort of becomes like a boogeyman or a demon. Something you read, it sort of sends a chill down your spine.
You'll meet the people whose presence continues to be felt from the grave.
He imagined a secret society which would be watching the schools, the universities, to establish a worldwide English-speaking global elite.
There is no chapter of history that is off limits, and each and every one of these inflection points has somehow reshaped your life and my life.
I don't think this is talked about enough.
The outcome of World War II was not a foregone conclusion.
We think that restitution is a contemporary debate. It's really not. It's been going on forever.
No one saw it coming. Brand new episodes every Tuesday. You can listen on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Had Freud been alive at the time, he would have had a field day with all of this.